This is the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. I'm James Sully. Today we're being your election guide. I'm bringing in our political analyst, Dr. Susan MacManus at the University of South Florida, to talk about all things Florida and the general election. What certain trends mean? How does it compare to 2016? And she gives us some predictions on what could happen election night or what may not happen election night. We start with an analysis of the polls, which right now heavily favor Democratic challenger Joe Biden. But as Dr. MacManus cautions, don't pay too much attention to the polls. Kind of like what happened 4 years ago. Here she is.
Well, polls still have a lot of flaws, and polls are still just a snapshot in time. For example, if you went to the Real Clear Politics and you actually knew what dates you were looking at that the polling was done, and for example, one was done before the president went to the hospital a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
One after, and the direction of the polling had changed. Polls are limited in that they cannot predict turnout. They have a very difficult time predicting any kind of enthusiasm. They can't really articulate people who will not answer a poll, what that looks like, what that group's looks like. They differ in the number of people that they sample, how they contact somebody, how they define a likely voter, which all of them say they're polling likely voters. Sometimes a likely voter is simply you telling a pollster when they ask you how likely are you to vote, you say very likely. But better polls actually look at whether you voted in the past, and they sample off of actual voter history polls that are made public available by the state divisions of elections. So I think right now these polls are just a snapshot in time. They're heavily geared nationally towards larger areas dominating. But as you know, we elect presidents via the Electoral College. And we don't elect by popular opinion polls, etc. And Florida, for example, is a state which is virtually statistically tied and has been for months. And so you can't really use those polls to accurately predict. And they were certainly wrong in 2016. And by the way, they were wrong for some of the same kinds of reasons that we see they could possibly be wrong this time. And that is, they are not likely to capture people who are unwilling to talk to a pollster. Who are they? They're more likely to be Republicans who feel demonized by the news media, and they simply don't ever want to talk to a pollster. So then you have to ask yourself, are the Republicans who are answering, are they representative of the Republican voter overall? Polls have limits. And going to the bank on them sometimes can be very dangerous, especially in swing states like Florida.
Now, this year, of course, has some other challenges for us because in addition to kind of what we faced in 2016, as you were talking about, Dr. MacManus, with, the likely voter giving pollers correct information, we've got this pandemic going on, and it's going to greatly impact how votes are received and at what point they're counted. Let's foreshadow election night a little bit. What does your gut tell you? What are you thinking right now? How does Tuesday, November 3rd play out in your mind at this point?
Well, probably very close and not likely to know definitively who won on election night. And there are three good reasons why we aren't going to know definitively who won on election night. All of them are very legal and understandable. One is, with a lot of people voting by mail, a lot of those ballots won't come in till the day of or a day or so before then. Well, the signatures have to be checked for those absentee ballots to make sure that that's a legitimate voter. And that can't all be done on election day. You'll have to carry over. Secondly, some people, when they go vote early, they forget their ID. And so they have to cast a provisional ballot. And then after the election is over, a canvassing board looks at the provisional ballots to see whether that person is really registered or not. And if they are, their vote counts. And the third would happen is that for overseas voters and military voters, by law, their ballots aren't due until 10 days after the election. So you can easily see why Florida might have a lot of votes in those three categories. And if it's close, you will not know on election night who won. A good example was in 2018 with the Commissioner of Agriculture's race. When you went to bed on election night, you did not think Nikki Fried had won. But after all of these other votes were counted, she won. So the same thing could happen with the presidential contest. Or, on the other hand, it could be a runaway, and we won't even be wondering what all of these uncounted votes look like. They will be counted, however. The idea that there are some that don't count just because there's a runaway race, that's not accurate. They are all counted ultimately.
Of course, that's good to know. She's Dr. Susan MacManus. She is our political expert here on ABC Action News, joining us here on the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. You have studied Florida elections and the impact of votes in specific areas for such a long time. You are the expert on it. You took me to school 4 years ago when I was new here in Tampa, and I was reporting and doing a lot of work in the field ahead of the 2016 election. You spoke of how important the I-4 corridor is, how that is time and time again so important. You obviously still feel that way. Can you explain why that is just so crucial to our state and the electoral votes that go along with it?
To put it simply, it's the swing part of the swing state. Florida can go either direction. That's why we're called a bellwether, a battleground state, swing state. The I-4 corridor is defined as the Tampa media market, which is 10 counties, plus the Orlando media market. And together, those two media markets with their counties contain 45% of all Florida's registered voters, which number over 14 million. So 45% of all Florida's registered voters are in the Tampa and Orlando media markets. And on top of it, these two markets, out of the 10 media markets that exist in all of Florida, these two media markets are the most evenly divided between registered Democrats and Republicans, and have around the state average of no party affiliation registrants. So these are very, very competitive parts of our state. They can go in either direction, and that's why you see the candidates spending so much money on ads, and why the candidates, if they can travel, they tend to come to the I-4 corridor in some fashion or another, because they need to appeal to the voters in this area, which have a history of, as these swing areas go, so goes Florida. And as Florida goes, so goes the nation.
Very, very good point there at the end, because so many times that has been the case, and it was the case in 2016. Let's talk a little bit about, let's expound on that a little bit. Can you bullet point for me just a couple of reasons why Donald Trump won the state of Florida in 2016?
A lot of it was people felt very frustrated with politics as usual. And he articulated sort of a maverick view of shaking up the system. Mm-hmm. And there's still a little bit of that. A lot of it when it comes to Congress, for many voters who don't follow politics day in and day out, they kind of tune in, tune out. But one thing that they are in agreement with is that Washington is broken. It's the Congress right now can't fix a big problem and can't help Americans when they need it most. So Donald Trump came in as sort of an outsider, and people who supported him, a lot of them were the sort of working individual, working hard, making a living, send their kids to school, all of that. Middle income individuals who looked at government in Washington and saw what they, in their minds, saw was a system that was very accessible to the extremely wealthy through lobbyists and so forth. And then they looked at people who were less well off than they, and they sort of divided it into two categories. Mm-hmm. The truly, genuinely needy and those who they saw as sort of scamming the system. So somebody comes in like Donald Trump, who's very unconventional, very maverick, and was a choice that they hadn't had in a long time. And so you saw people voting for him that had never voted before, number one, or hadn't voted in years. And number two, people that had never voted Republican sort of voting for him because it wasn't so much a party as it was him as a personality and something different.
So let's fast forward to now. You get out a lot, Dr. MacManus. You really talk to the people in this area, particularly the Bay Area, some of the areas you're talking about before. Are you seeing a big difference in the landscape now, this time around? Where's the smart money at this point?
The betting odds are on Biden, but they were wrong last time too, so you got to be careful. There are some areas where Trump has had a little bit of difficulty, and a lot of it is with women voters who some don't like the tone and his demeanor. They don't think he acts very presidential. It's often true of older women. And for some of the, women with kids, they worry that he's not setting a good example in his language and demeanor with their young kids, where there's a lot of discussion about not bullying in schools. They're learning that. So they worry about that. So he's struggling a little bit with women voters, and much more than he did last time, because if you went back and looked at the exit polls for 2016, the women's vote was more evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans in Florida than any other state.
I was just going to say, because this sounds like some of the things that were concerns for him last time around, but you're telling me that it's even more pronounced this time.
A little bit more. The gender gap is showing up in virtually every poll. Mm-hmm. And it's also a key part of both parties' strategies now. All you have to do is to look at television political ads. Just, make yourself sit down and look at them, and look at who is in the ad and what are they talking about. So right now, a lot of the ads are focusing on women voters, whether they're Democrat or Republican ads. And some of them feature older women, but some of them feature younger women with children. And it is historically true in our state that it's the suburban mom with kids that often switches between Democrats and Republicans, because they're thinking less about party and more about what's best for their children. That's why this election cycle, we're really carefully watching what the suburban moms are thinking about all of the back to school issues and COVID and how that interfaces with each other.
Because that right there could be the biggest swing demographic that out there right now. The suburban moms.
And it's also true that suburban women have been a little bit more likely to be part-time and laid off or furloughed or whatever else.
Directly impacted by the pandemic, right?
Right. And so, if it looks to them, whichever candidate looks to be the one that, is most in tune with their own economic needs, but especially the needs of their family and their children, that's often the way that they're going to vote. So there's a lot of appeal to the suburban mom. So if you look at some of the ads, and some of it's through the economy. For example, Trump's ads really stress the fact that women have benefited, and they show family things from his economy. Whereas in contrast, Biden is aiming more towards the older woman who might be stripped away from being Republican last time, but vote Democrat this time, through healthcare. So it's really important that when you look at these ads, you figure out whose vote are they trying to get with who's featured in the ad and what message they're pushing.
Interesting. Yep. Never thought to look that deep into it. Of course, we're all inundated with those political ads now, Dr. MacManus. I mean, that's all we have between the commercial breaks here on Good Morning Tampa Bay at this point, but that's kind of a 4-year thing. We kind of get used to it. So it's hard. Sometimes they go down like water, and you don't really pick up on things because there's just so many of them. But
there's so many that $243 million have already been expended by the parties in ads in Florida.
That seems like a tremendous amount of money for just advertising.
And usually what you have is people will say, well, all of that money, if we'd taken all that money, we could have fixed all the problems of the state.
Sure.
And I think one of the things that's really frustrating voters right now is the fact that Congress, particularly, at a time when Americans need help the most, their government's not there for them. They can't even agree on whether to meet about fixing a new, stimulus package to help everyday people. That kind of thing lingers in people's minds very heavily when they go vote. That kind of inaction on the part of Congress. The question is whether they're going to blame the president for not being able to shake Congress loose,
right?
Or whether they're going to blame Congress for not letting the president do what he said he was going to do.
Oh, I just talked to an accounting firm last week and in great detail, and this morning we ran the story. They feel that it's obvious that another stimulus package is needed for small businesses in the Bay Area in particular, highlighting the hospitality industry. I mean, it's something that it's no question needed for them, and I think there's probably a lot of people that could use another round of stimulus checks. I don't think there's any doubt about it. We see the job numbers. We obviously know that there are people right now that could use a little bit of help, especially as we get into the fall, and there's obviously a lot of things that require payment and require money in the fall as we turn things over into another quarter. So there's no doubt about that. Now, as we move forward, Trump's back on the campaign trail. Joe Biden is doing a town hall in place of the second debate. It's pretty obvious. Biden's time out on the campaign trail is a lot more calculated than Trump's. They don't have the big groups of people gathered together. That could be bad messaging for some people who do feel and are a little bit more fearful of the virus. Trump's campaigning, a lot of enthusiasm. I'm still seeing the same thing I saw 4 years ago, though. I am seeing an enthusiasm gap. The people that go out and go to these rallies for our president, they show up in droves. And there's a lot of energy there, and I don't see that on the other side, but is that just perception? Am I missing something? Is there enthusiasm for Biden that you're seeing and feeling that isn't a repeat of where we were 4 years ago between Clinton and a lack of enthusiasm and Trump?
You do see it, but not exhibited in a physical way. So you're seeing a lot of enthusiasm, for example, among older women. And some of the Supreme Court discussions going on right now are really mobilizing even some young progressives on the courts and some of the issues there. But when you can't go out and draw a crowd, and of course, much of the attention of the news media has been on the giant rallies that he can have and the enthusiasm exuding. But polls are showing that this is the most enthusiasm that we have seen for a presidential election on both sides of the aisle in decades. And it's also true that some of the Democrats that are really the most passionate tend to be older women who are going to just not be out there waving flags or whatever else. But what they are doing is writing checks, volunteering to make phone calls, all of those kinds of activism, which don't draw the big headlines.
Well, I wanted to do prediction time here, if we could. But, what's, I guess, most important and what's on people's minds, how many people have asked you this question? Dr. MacManus, as Dr. Susan MacManus here, our political expert, joins me on the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast. How many people have asked you this question? Well, after the election, the pandemic's going to be over. Because they feel that this situation we have with the virus has been so politicized, they really feel like, based on the results of the election, well, the pandemic will just go away.
Now, I haven't heard that one. I thought you were going to ask me who was going to win. Well, and I always have a stock answer there.
I'm a little too smart. I was wet behind the ears when I asked you that. I'm not gonna ask you who's going to win. I'd rather talk to you about the trends that you see and maybe where the smart money is in certain areas. Hillsborough County, we're talking to a lot of people who live in Hillsborough County when we do this podcast. And you made this very clear to me last time, is that there's something really strange about Hillsborough County, and that the winner of that county in all but I think 23 of the last 24 presidential elections, Don't quote me on that, but I believe it's something around that. The winner of Hillsborough County not only won Florida, but also won the presidential election. Now, Hillary bucked that trend because in 2016, she did win the county of Hillsborough, lost the state, lost the election. But there's something strange about Hillsborough County, and it's got to be the play on that same thing you talked about, the I-4 corridor. It's just a very diverse county. It's a swing county and a swing state.
Yeah, and it's less predictable than it was before because it is turning a bit bluer because it is seeing an influx of a lot of younger people. The age demographic of Hillsborough is getting younger. And, there's a larger portion of younger voters who register as no party affiliation, but they lean more Democratic in their voting.
Sure.
And so you're seeing that right now, this election cycle. I've, seen a lot of people pointing to Pinellas as sort of the county people are going to look at, even though some people totally disagree with that. But the percentage between Democrats and Republicans in Pinellas is very close. And of course, Trump narrowly won that county last time, but then some of their other elections subsequently have gone more Democratic. I personally, as an analyst, like to look at the margin of victory in some of these suburban counties with middle class, family, largely residential voter compositions, because the suburban vote is really often the swing. Rural areas in Florida, very, very red, very Republican. Big urban areas lean blue, but it's the purple areas, the family kind of places that tend to be the purplest and can swing in one direction or another. And there, it's not so much that you're looking at who wins the county. You're looking if that county traditionally votes for, let's say, Republicans, and the candidates usually win there by 5%. Well, all of a sudden it's election night and they're winning by 20. That gives you an idea, whoa, this is going to be more of a Republican night. But if the reverse is true, then you have to conclude, well, maybe this is going to be a Democratic night.
And you're giving us some insight into how networks call these states. That's how they look at those trends and try and pick up on that and go from there. We're at the point where Biden's lead nationally with some of these polls, it's at the point where it's nearly what Ronald Reagan's was when he collected over 500 electoral votes and got his second term. Can you make a case for Trump still achieving re-election here despite what we see in the polls? And what does this do to our system if he does win? And for the second straight election cycle, we see these giant leads, albeit nationally, but then something completely different happens on election day and the actual votes come through.
Right. Trump's got a difficult road. It's more difficult than Biden's right now. He's got to really win some of those Rust Belt states that he narrowly won before. And that would be like Michigan and Wisconsin in particular. Some say Minnesota. He also, most importantly, has to win Florida. There's a lot of thought that if he doesn't carry Florida, he's not going to win re-election. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's going to be here again twice in this week alone into Florida. He also needs to carry Arizona. So he's got some specific states that he won last time that are going to be tough to replicate. And, there are others that are iffy. So he's got a more uphill battle to get reelected. But Biden is not really a shoo-in either. If he loses 2 or 3 of these states that they won last time, he could be in a bad way too. So there are a lot of people speculating, well, what happens if neither of these candidates gets 270 electoral college votes? What happens? Then it goes to the U.S. House of Representatives to choose the president and to the U.S. Senate to choose the vice president. And if the presidential race goes to the U.S. House of Representatives, each state gets 1 vote. So it would take 26 votes for that person to be elected president. And the top 3 vote getters are who has to be considered. So it hasn't been done since the early 1800s. But anyway, the good news is we have constitutional provisions for how all of this works. It's not going to be somebody arbitrarily making up rules as they go along. These are clearly laid out in the Constitution.
Well, far be it for me to put past something, that hasn't had for 200 years happening in this year, 2020, when it seems like everything else that we've been through. Why not? Let's have the House of Representatives choose our next president. Well, I have to say, I can't thank you enough for your time. You're very, very busy, Dr. MacManus, but I appreciate it, and hopefully you'll hop on with me again after Election Day. I would really like to break down what we're seeing. Maybe we have a winner. Maybe we don't. It could take days, weeks. You even said on the phone, it could be months. Be ready for anything, right?
It could be. I mean, this is an election year where political scientists are going to have to go back and rewrite the textbooks. There's nothing textbook about this election, and I think that's what makes it very exciting and why enthusiasm is such a fever pitch. And I'm really happy that you do these podcasts and people enjoy them. I know. Different way to get informed, and that's another real change this time out. We have so many different ways to be able to reach voters, and the candidates do too. So they figure out, do I spend money on social media? Do I spend it on TV? Do I spend it here, there, what? It's very, very tough to win Florida. It takes a lot of money and a lot of calculations, but it's the big prize.
There's no doubt it's the big prize. How many times? We'll end it with this. So goes Florida, so goes the rest of the country. She's Dr. Susan MacManus. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
New episodes of the Rebound Tampa Bay podcast come your way every Wednesday morning. They are on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher, and you can watch a video version on the ABC Action News streaming news channel. Just find that on your favorite streaming device.